When combating a national pandemic that is asymptomatic in some and deadly in others, how do you weigh public health against civil liberties? That is a balance that many longtime civil liberties advocates, like friend of the show Glenn Greenwald, are trying to find.
He recently told BuzzFeed, quote, "The kind of digital surveillance that I spent a lot of years, even before Snowden, and then obviously the 2 or 3 years during Snowden, advocating against is now something I could be warranted principally to stave off more brute solutions that were used in China." Glenn is the co-founding editor of The Intercept. He joins us now via Skype, and he actually has an exciting announcement to make. We should make at the top. Glenn, what do we want to tell everybody about what's going on?
Yeah, so prior to the outbreak of this global pandemic, we were at The Intercept working on producing and developing a new program that I would host, designed to have interviews and the like in both English and Portuguese, 2 separate shows that would be done in partnership with the Brazilian TV audience. And with the pandemic, we decided to do a sort of stripped down version of it that is going to be launched on YouTube for now. And the debut of the show, which is called System Update with Glenn Greenwald, is today at 2 p.m. on the Intercept's YouTube program, and it's designed to explore the Sanders campaign of 2020, what happened, and it has 2 really great guests with different views, which is Kyle Kulinski of the wildly popular Secular Talk YouTube program, and then Liz Franczyk, who's the co-host of the TrueAnon podcast. So it's I'm very excited by it.
That sounds great.
Awesome, and I know our audience will be really excited to tune into that as well, so congrats on that. Conversation you and I have been having that BuzzFeed then picked up on is this idea of balancing civil liberties in this moment when there's a lot of justification for, the type of surveillance and control of movement and all these sort of restrictions on our liberty that are in the best interest of the public health. How are you thinking about those balances right now in this moment?
Yeah, it is very difficult and complicated because how it manifests in different countries is very different. And I think that one of the points I was making in an interview that I gave to BuzzFeed, which was about a week ago, so even my thinking has evolved a little bit, is that one of the things I noticed in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic spreading beyond China and then obviously coming to the U.S. and to Latin America is once you start feeling imperiled by a threat, not necessarily you yourself, but the society in which you live, that the social order, the political order are threatened, as are democratic freedoms, instinctively you start almost by nature wanting protection from the state. You start wanting the state to do things collectively in order to respond to this danger. And the psychological instinct to desire that can lead you to start thinking that certain measures that would have been previously unthinkable to you in terms of advocating are now warranted. And so it doesn't mean that I'm suddenly in favor of mass surveillance or think that we ought to throw caution to the wind with concerns about authoritarianism. Quite the contrary, I think we need to fight against that instinct. But I also think we need to recognize that unlike in the war on terror, where the argument of civil libertarians was that the threat of Muslim extremism or terrorism was being exaggerated and therefore grave erosions of our liberties were unwarranted, this threat is very real and very acute, and the consequences are difficult to imagine in terms of how pervasive they are in every aspect of society, and therefore we ought to be more open to the kinds of measures that maybe 3 months ago we never would have considered, but we need to do so in a really careful way to make sure they don't become permanent or excessive or exploited.
Right.
Well, that was the thing, Glenn. Everyone was like, wait, Glenn Greenwald supports mass surveillance now? It's like, no, Glenn Greenwald does not support mass surveillance now. But let's talk about the carefulness. How is it possible to institute some of these surveillance techniques in the course of law without ensuring, which you have covered for so long, which is that they just build upon each other to become perma-authorities of the national security state that end up getting exploited for political ends in bipartisan administrations? How do you fight against that and make sure that these types of things are instituted responsibly?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I remember that very well, that in the wake of, even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when everybody was in the U.S. or virtually everybody was extremely traumatized by that attack, the Patriot Act was regarded, even then, you can go in October and November of 2001 and see editorials warning of how radical of a measure it was. And the answer was, oh, don't worry, there's a sunset provision in it to ensure that it has to be renewed after 3 years or 4 years to ensure it doesn't remain permanent. And here we are 19 years later, almost 20 years later. Not only is the Patriot Act still completely in place, even when every 4 years a few senators try and institute some reforms, long past the height of the threat of al-Qaeda and Muslim terrorism, it gets 9 votes, 10 votes. The Patriot Act is now a permanent part of our political framework. Nobody even questions it any longer. No one regards it as radical anymore. And so that is the great concern, is how do you temporarily vest power in the hands of the state that might be necessary to preserve these liberties in the long term without simultaneously giving them those powers realistically, even if you intend for it to be temporary, in a way that becomes permanent. That's a dilemma that I don't quite yet know how to reconcile.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any real answer other than making sure that people are hyper aware and questioning and inquisitive of every new measure that's put in place. Does this really protect the public health, or is this about something else? And, you know, the sort of journalism and transparency that you and others have been doing to make sure people are aware of these restrictions and that they do, in fact, sunset. But it's a hard thing to do because, as we see, administration after administration, once you give them powers, they are loath to give those up. There was a news item that to me was just sort of like a troubling note. I mean, it's deeply troubling on many levels, but this one aspect of it in particular. So as you, I'm sure, followed, Amazon workers at a warehouse in Staten Island, a number of them walked out, and one of the organizers of that protest was ultimately fired by Amazon. And the justification that they gave was that he had violated social distancing guidelines. And so you could see the way that these public health measures, really important measures that we all are and should be taking seriously, already being weaponized to sort of quash dissent of workers who are trying to protest what they saw as unsafe, unsanitary, and unfair conditions in their workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the, I think, overlooked aspects of the way in which our political order has already been altered, probably irrevocably, by this pandemic, which is, if you think about it, the largest and most powerful states and the largest and most powerful corporations are able to exploit this to become even more powerful. There's going to be a lot of companies that go out of business as a result of the slowdown or shutdown of the global economy, and the ones that remain in place, like Amazon, are going to get more powerful. Simultaneously, we're all separated from one another. We're all physically isolated from each other. And we're being trained psychologically to regard one another as threats, as vectors of a lethal disease. That's how we're just instinctively designed now to view other human beings. And our capacity to do anything was already very limited prior to this pandemic against these massive international global corporations or authoritarian states. We can't even join together to protest now. That Amazon protest, that strike, was extremely small, and yet they invoked health concerns, as you said, to almost try and criminalize it, to justify the firing of one of the organizers. So it's very difficult. Here in Brazil, for example, when people want to protest the Bolsonaro government for its completely deranged and reckless and even homicidal treatment of this pandemic, people stay inside their apartments, go to the window, and bang on pots with spoons, which makes a lot of noise, but it's not very menacing. So as these power centers strengthen as a result of this pandemic, we, the citizenry, are becoming more fractured and more divided and weakened and trained to regard one another as threats to ourselves, making our ability to confront these erosions even more limited and impotent. And that's one of the big concerns I have.
Mm-hmm. And Glenn, as somebody who fought, has been fighting against these kind of incursions now for quite some time, what were some of the breaking points in the fight against the Patriot Act or bringing up public awareness of all of this? What were the things that really connected with people in trying to highlight that type of transparency in the years that you've been trying to highlight this issue?
Well, the great challenge always was that we as human beings are are physiologically and psychologically constructed to have fear be one of the most potent drives. It's necessary for our survival, or always has been, and still really is. It's a primal drive that is very potent and necessary for our survival. So demagogues and authoritarians can always stimulate fear as a means of getting people to capitulate to erosions of freedom. So the challenge then becomes, well, how is it that you can overcome that? And really, you need to use the same tactic. And one of the things we were able to do, for example, in the Snowden case, was to make people understand that the global surveillance state that had been constructed in the dark by the United States and its allies, and that could be constructed by other governments, was also very scary and very menacing, and something that ought to be averted, not because of ethereal or abstract privacy concerns, which are second order to the first order survival concerns that we have, but also are very threatening to the things that we really cherish in a concrete way. And I think when you have people spending most of their day reading about hospitals being overrun and morgues being overrun and stories of 35-year-olds drowning in their own fluids in their lungs, it's very difficult to get people to see the threat of tyranny and authoritarianism as a competing danger. And that's the challenge that any of us who are worried about this imbalance arising are going to have to figure out.
Yeah, I think you see it also in, like, on the Democratic side in the media as well, the obsession with Andrew Cuomo. In Kentucky, there's also Andy Beshear, who I like. There's also, like, an obsession with him. Like, anyone who can just come out, tell me what to do, tell me what to think. Like, just, they're actually selling T-shirts in Kentucky that say, "Govern me, Daddy." Like, that's the instinct here. And, you know, a lot of progressives who have had issues with Cuomo for years, big justifiable issues with Andrew Cuomo, who is at the same time that he's leading the response in New York to the pandemic, is still trying to cut Medicaid. Suddenly, they see him as a sort of savior figure.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to acknowledge that that human beings are not driven purely by rational calculations. And in reality, the interview that I gave to BuzzFeed was more about that than it was about me changing my political views. It was really me observing the fact that even I, somebody kind of on the far, far end of civil libertarian extremism, and somebody who has been vested in those values and in that crusade for several decades, first as a lawyer and now as a journalist, I found myself internally, psychologically, almost subconsciously, abandoning that ethos, that instinct, in favor of craving greater security. And so the interview that I gave to Jersey Gray at BuzzFeed was really about how it alarmed me that even my own thought process, I could observe it changing almost without my involvement and without my will, because that is how our psyche is designed. And yeah, I mean, you know, there's a right-wing governor who's borderline fascist here in Rio de Janeiro state, who lots of people like me have actually started appreciating, because he's been standing up to the Bolsonaro government in terms of their denialism and has been ordering quarantines and shutting down public spaces. And when I first found myself almost being appreciative of that governor, that's when I knew things had really gone off the rails, and that we all need to be very vigilant about making sure that we're thinking about it in a sober way.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I also think, though, that it shows that some of the ways that your views have been caricatured were unfair, and that there's always been more nuance in thinking around when things are appropriate and when they're not. People should watch the show today. More importantly, they should subscribe to the Intercept's YouTube so that they don't miss any of your content. Glenn, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Glenn.
It.
Thank you, guys. Always great to talk to you.
Of course. All right, coming up, the Director of Strategic Communications for the Trump campaign. He's going to join us to talk about a potential Trump v. Biden matchup in November.